Hey everybody, Mr. Fantini here, and welcome to our first of a 3-video series on the 3 branches of the US government and the Constitution. Now, this is like one of my favorite topics to teach. I think it's one of the most important topics that I teach my students in a given year because even though I know not all my students are terribly interested in politics, this is something that affects all of us, right? This is what dictates the laws that we have to follow and the taxes that we have to pay. Even if we don't particularly find the government interesting, it does affect and shape our lives in really profound ways. And so it behooves us, it benefits us to understand where this power comes from and why it's structured the way that it is. Now, when the Constitution was written in the 1700s, one of the main concerns that its authors had about the government was they didn't want a king. I mean, that's what they had just fought this whole war over, was to break away from England, and this king that wanted to be an absolute monarch and that they thought was tyrannical was abusing his power. And so one of the safeguards against any one person having too much power and abusing it is to take that power and split it up. And that's sort of what they did by dividing the government into these 3 branches. And the idea behind it is that in order to exercise power, to force people to do things, all 3 branches need to work together. So theoretically, if one branch tries to do something messed up or tries to abuse its power, the other 2 will step in and stop it. And we'll talk about that system of checks and balances later on, but that just kind of gives you an idea of why these branches are split up. So our 3 branches are our legislative branch, or our Congress, which writes the laws, our executive branch, which enforces the laws, and our judicial branch. You see that word judge in there. This is our court system, which is responsible for interpreting the laws. And to just kind of illustrate the balance, or in some ways imbalance, between these 3 branches, let's take a look at the actual Constitution before we jump into our study of the legislative branch. Now, these are scans. This is pretty cool. It's from the National Archives. These are scans of the first 3 pages of the Constitution. But I just wanted to illustrate how much space each of these branches occupies on the actual page. Ideally, these 3 branches should be co-equal in power. They should be balanced together. But let's see if that plays out on the document here. The legislative branch is laid out in Article 1, and it takes up this much space, almost 2 full pages of the Constitution, laying out the powers and structure of the legislative branch. The executive branch, enforcing the laws, takes up a little bit less space, maybe a little bit less than 1 page. And the poor judicial branch, womp womp, takes up less than half of a page, just a little tiny paragraph there. As we'll see, the Supreme Court kind of has to figure out its power for itself in the first couple of years of the United States, but we'll get there with a 3rd video later on. For now, let's jump into the branch which probably is the most powerful, definitely has the most powers, and is the most complicated one, the legislative branch, also known as our Congress. Now, as you might have covered earlier, the Congress of the United States is a bicameral legislature. Bi meaning 2, cameral meaning chamber. It's a 2-chamber Congress. Now, you might have studied this before. This was a compromise, this decision to make it bicameral. It was a compromise between the small states and the big states at the Constitutional Convention, where the small states didn't want to be left behind. They said that all states should have the same number of votes in Congress. They wanted equal representation, where all states had the same number of representatives in Congress. And that sounds great. You know, we love, equality. All the states are equal. That sounds awesome. But the big states said, well, if my state has 10 times the number of people as your state, why should we have the same number of votes? So many more people live in my state than live in your state. They wanted proportional representation, where more people meant more votes in Congress and more power for that state to pass the laws and vote on the laws that benefited it. Now, this seems like a bit of an impasse, right? Some states want equal, some states want proportional. And so to resolve this, they came up with a bicameral legislature that said, why don't we just do both of them? We'll have a House of Representatives that uses proportional representation, and we'll have a Senate that uses equal representation. These 2 houses, the House of Representatives and the Senate, come together to form our Congress. When we say Congress, we're referring to both houses, right? And in order for a law to be passed and applied to everybody in the whole country, it's got to pass in both houses. That's what passing in Congress means. Now let's break these down and take a look at these 2 houses individually. Let's start with the House of Representatives. Now, before we begin here, I should stipulate that I'm making this video in October of 2020. We are like a week and a half away from a very, very big national election. And so if you're watching this after January of 2021, these numbers are probably going to be out of date. I'm just using the most up-to-date ones that I have to illustrate some of these concepts, but it might not look this way by the time you're watching it. So the House of Representatives has 435 representatives. That's a lot of people. And those representatives are distributed according to population. That means bigger states, states with more people, get more representatives, more votes in Congress, and more power to pass legislation that benefits them. Some of the biggest states have dozens of representatives. The smallest states, like Wyoming and Vermont, they only get one. A representative's term is 2 years, meaning that every 2 years they got to go back and run for re-election, or they could resign and have someone else run for election, I guess. The leader of the House of Representatives is called the Speaker of the House. This is a representative who is voted on by the members of the House. And just typically how it breaks down is that is a powerful representative of the party with the majority. So if we look at our current House of Representatives, our 435 reps are broken down. There are 232 Democrats, 197 Republicans. There's one Libertarian who's a guy who changed parties. He was initially a Republican, so he kind of tends to vote with them. We have a couple empty seats right now. But the important thing here is that the majority right now is Democratic. And so the Democratic Party gets to choose the Speaker of the House. The current Speaker of the House is Nancy Pelosi. You may have heard of her. Do you want to be representative? Well, all you got to do is be 25. You have to have been living in the U.S. for 7 years. And you got to live in the district that you represent. If you qualify for those 3 things and you can get the signatures and then get the votes, you can get on the ballot and you can run for representative, and you can be one of the 435 people who votes for laws that apply to the entire country. All right. So that's our House of Representatives. Let's go across the Capitol building to the other wing and check out the Senate. Now, the first thing that you'll probably notice is, like, man, oh man, way fewer people, right? Only 100 senators. That's not a lot considering they're voting on laws that affect, 340 million people in the United States. So there are 100 senators in the Senate. This is because we have equal representation there. There are 2 senators for each state. It doesn't matter if your state has 500,000 people or 40 million people, everybody gets 2 senators. Senators' terms are much longer. They're 6 years, meaning every 2 years we do have Senate elections, but they're staggered. So, 1 year you'll elect 33 senators, 2 years later 33, 2 years later 34, so that you're not swapping out the whole Senate in a given year. The leader of the Senate, quote unquote, is the vice president, who also serves as president of the Senate. The only reason that the vice president gets involved, the vice president's usually out doing things with the presidential administration. The reason that the vice president is involved is because there are 2 senators per state, meaning there's always going to be an equal number in the Senate, meaning sometimes you're going to have a tie. There are some very close votes that come down to 50-50. And in those cases, the vice president is allowed to come in and cast the tie-breaking vote, usually voting with their own party, obviously. So if you want to be a senator, the job requirements are a little bit more stringent. This is kind of called the upper house. It's much more selective. You got to be 30. You have to have been living in the U.S. for 9 years, and you got to live in the state that you represent. Obviously not incredibly stringent requirements, but these are very, very powerful positions, and the parties take them obviously very seriously. I mean, think about it. If you're in the Senate, you are 1/100th of a vote to make a law pass that would apply to the entire country, which is pretty crazy. Right now, you might also notice, this might be out of date by the time you see it, but there is a Republican majority in the Senate. There are 53 Republicans, 45 Democrats, and 2 independents that, similarly to the Libertarian and the House of Representatives, almost always vote with the Democrats. So it's pretty much a 53-47 breakdown there. This is part of the reason why it has been so difficult for laws to be passed in the past couple of years, because we have the Senate is controlled by one party and the House is controlled by the other. And for laws to pass for the whole country, they have to pass in both houses, and those 2 parties don't agree on a lot of things. And so when the legislature is split, when they're controlled by opposite parties, it becomes much, much more difficult for legislation to get passed. Let's just break down just the difference between what equal and proportional representation means. I mean, I've given you the definition, but let's break it down and illustrate it right now. So up here, we have the top 5 most populous states, top 5 states with the most people, and the bottom 3 least populous states, states with the fewest number of people. Now, in the House of Representatives, more people is more votes, meaning more power. So if we take a look at these extremes here, we see a big difference in representatives, right? California has almost 40 million people. That's a lot of people. And as a result, they get 53 seats in the House of Representatives. Gives California a lot of power in determining the legislation for the rest of the country. Meanwhile, little old Wyoming, least populous state, very beautiful, but not a lot of people there, has just under 600,000 people. They only get one. Only one vote goes to Wyoming there. But if you go, again, across the Capitol building to the Senate, California's 40 million people gets the exact same number of Senate seats as Wyoming's under 600,000. 2 Senate seats for California, 2 Senate seats for Wyoming. Now, again, the reason that we have this, it was a compromise between big states and small states way back in the Constitutional Convention in the 1700s. The effects of it, though, are very long-ranging, right? And it can create some kind of wacky outcomes a little bit, particularly when we talk about the presidential elections, which, if you've heard of the Electoral College, we'll talk about that some other time, but that is a function of the total number of seats here. One other thing I want to point out, which is a little bit funny, is that you might notice that in between Vermont and Alaska, we have the District of Columbia, aka Washington, D.C., our nation's capital. Washington, D.C. does not belong to any state. It's its own little thing. It's a little district that's kind of carved out of Virginia down there. And there are 700,000 people that live in Washington, D.C. That's a lot of people. It's a pretty big city, right? There are more people in Washington, D.C. than in the states of Vermont and Wyoming, which is kind of crazy to think about. However, the strange thing about this is that the Constitution does not stipulate any representation for the people of Washington, D.C., meaning that despite having more people than Vermont and Wyoming, the people who live in D.C. get no votes in Congress, which is a little bit strange if you think about it. 500,000 people or 600,000 people in Wyoming get 3 votes in Congress. 700,000 people in DC get 0. So where you live has an impact on how much power you are represented with in the government, which is a little bit strange, especially when you consider that one of the main reasons for the American Revolution was taxation without representation, which is what we do to the citizens of our capital. But let's move right along and talk about what Congress actually does. Now, the one thing that we've been talking about this entire time is the fact that Congress writes and passes laws, right? I mean, that's their most basic function, their most important function. How that actually happens is that the congressmen and women are divided up into committees. There are committees in both the House and the Senate, and they're divided up by their expertise. And the laws of our country begin as bills in these committees. And these committees, they workshop these laws, they revise them, they change them, they debate them. And eventually, if they think that a bill has a chance of passing in the rest of the chamber, they will move that law and introduce it to the floor where it's voted on by everybody. These committees can range on topics of healthcare to defense and international relations to transportation, all these different topics that some congressmen and senators and representatives and congressmen become experts on so that they can pass good legislation for the whole country. Sort of. This is sort of, again, one thing I want to emphasize over the course of this is that I'm giving you an explanation of how these things are supposed to work in theory. Now, do they always work that way in practice is another question. One big unaccounted for force in this process is the phenomenon of lobbyists, which are a major, major factor in the laws that get passed in our country. Lobbyists are basically people who go to congressmen and advocate for them to pass particular laws that benefit particular groups of people or particular business interests or industries or companies. Again, that's something that we can kind of dive into a little bit later, but just know that what that term means. It basically means people who advocate for particular types of legislation. They get paid a lot of money to do it. Some other stuff that Congress does is pass the national budget. And this is maybe one of the biggest powers given to any one of the branches in the Constitution. It's sometimes called the power of the purse, referring to, your purse where you keep your money. By giving Congress the power to decide how much money goes to various departments and areas of the government, Congress is given a kind of power to guide policy, right? So let's say that we have a president, and the president's the commander-in-chief of the military. Let's say that the president wants to do a particular military operation that Congress doesn't agree with. They could very easily just cut the funding for whatever branch of the military he was planning on using, and that would make it impossible for the president to exercise that power. So that's a little bit complicated, but just know that by deciding where money goes, Congress has a lot of power to allows certain parts of the government to function well and prevent other parts of the government from functioning as well. Another thing that Congress does is conduct investigations and release reports to members of the government or to the public. They do this with subpoena power, which is something that is given to them in the Constitution. Subpoena, you may have heard of that in reference to a court where, if someone gets served papers, they have to come to the court and testify. Congress can do the exact same thing. Subpoena means under penalty, under poena, penalty. That means that they have the power to give you an order. They say you have to come to Congress and talk to us and answer our questions on this day. And if you don't show up or you don't cooperate, they can fine you or throw you in jail. This is a way that they can gather information that they think should be public or that they think should be available to certain departments of the government. One of the most famous examples of this is after the assassination of John F. Kennedy. There was a committee put together in Congress to gather information pertaining to the assassination and release it to the government and eventually to the public. Another thing that Congress can do is they can propose constitutional amendments. This isn't something that we'll go into in great detail because this doesn't happen quite as often, but Congress gets the process started by proposing an amendment and then sending it out to the states. In order to be added to the Constitution, that amendment must be ratified or accepted by 3/4 of the states. So that's very, very hard to do. That's only happened one time in my lifetime. So these are sort of the main powers of Congress. But another thing that we want to take a quick look at here are the checks and balances that Congress has on other branches of government. And we'll talk about this with all three branches. All branches have checks and balances on the other two. One major power that Congress has is approving or rejecting presidential appointments. And when we say appointments in this case, we mean the president basically picking or hiring someone to do a very important job in the government. Most famously, especially right now, if you've been following the news, is the president has the power to appoint or nominate judges and Supreme Court justices, federal judges and Supreme Court justices. These are very, very important positions, and the president has the power to pick whoever the president wants for them, but that selection must be approved of by 51 senators, by more than half of the Senate. The same thing applies to cabinet secretaries and to diplomats, because these are very important high-level positions within the judicial or the executive branch, and the Senate has to give the okay. If they feel like the person's not qualified, they can reject them and say, no, you got to pick somebody else. This is a big one. And again, if you were following the news in the past year, this is one that came up a whole lot. Congress has the power to impeach a government official if that official is suspected of committing a crime in office. Now, this is something that I'm going to clarify now and again when we get to the executive branch. Impeachment is one of these really poorly understood. A lot of people think it means something that it doesn't. An impeachment is not when you kick someone out of office. An impeachment is when you accuse a public official of a crime. It's similar to like an indictment, which is what happens to a person when they're put on trial. So if someone gets impeached, it doesn't mean necessarily that they committed a crime, but it does mean that they are going to be put on trial for it. This is done in both houses of Congress, where the impeachment process starts in the House of Representatives, who votes on articles of impeachment, but then the articles of impeachment go over to the Senate, whose responsibility it is to hold a trial. The Senate basically converts itself into a courtroom. They hold a trial to investigate the accusations of wrongdoing and eventually vote whether or not to remove that person from office. And this is a pretty difficult process because it needs 67 votes in the Senate. That's 2/3 of the Senate need to agree to remove somebody from office. So pretty stringent process. We'll talk more about that when we get to the president and the executive branch. Another power Congress has is the power to override a presidential veto. Now, I've said it a bunch of times that in order for a law to pass, it's got to pass in both houses of Congress. A majority of the House and a majority of the Senate both need to vote to approve the law. But that's not where it ends. From there, it goes to the desk of the president. And since the president is the chief law enforcement officer of the country, he's the number one person in charge of enforcing the law, the president has the final say so, yes or no, on that law. If the president says yes, he signs it. If the president says no, it's a veto. All right. But again, this is another check and balance. We don't want any one person or group to have too much power in the government. What if the president vetoes a law that should exist, that's popular, that the Senate says, no, we need this law, and the president, for one reason or another, decides he doesn't want it? Congress actually has the power to override that veto by voting on the law again and trying to pass it with a 2/3 super majority, 67% in both houses. This very rarely happens. It's very hard to get 67% of any group of people to agree on anything, much less 67% of Congress. So these are some of the ways that Congress can keep the other branches in check. Now, to wrap up here, I kind of want to come back to that concept of representation that we talked about in the very beginning of this video. Now, the basis of our government is that we are a democratic republic, meaning that the people vote on representatives who then go and represent our interests to the government. One question that we have to ask ourselves when we compare our Congress to our country, if we had something that's called perfect representation, our Congress would look very, very similar to our country, just on a much smaller scale. However, as we'll see, that's not exactly how things work out. So to wrap things up for today, let's take a look at how representative our Congress is of our country at large. We'll start with a breakdown by gender. And this is a slightly older piece of statistical data here. It doesn't really account for the about between a half a percentage point and 1 percentage point of the United States population that doesn't identify as either male or female. But generally speaking, if you look at any population, it breaks down about 50-50, right? Our Congress, on the other hand, is not 50-50. The House of Representatives, there are 101 women to 334 men. That's like a little bit less than a quarter of the House of Representatives is women. And we see almost the exact same story in the Senate, where a little bit less than a quarter of senators are women. So 3/4 men. Next, let's take a look at race and ethnicity. Now, this is slightly out of date data. This is from 2013. We'll have a much more accurate, much more up-to-date picture after they tally the 2020 census. But as of 2013, the estimates was that the United States population was about 62% white, about 17% Hispanic or Latino, 13% African American, 5% Asian or Pacific Islander, 1% Native American, and 2% identifying as biracial. If we take a look at the breakdown of our Congress, it is much less diverse than that. Out of the 535 members of our Congress, that's the House of Representatives plus the Senate, 415, over 4/5 are white. We only have 43 Hispanic congressmen, 17 Asian congressmen, 56 Black congressmen, and 4 Native American congressmen. So it's much less, even though this is by far the most diverse Congress in American history, it is still way less diverse than the population writ large. Let's talk about income and net worth. If you look at the American population as a whole, about 5% of Americans, about 1 out of 20 Americans, have a net worth of $1 million. That's combining, the balance of their bank account and their assets, what they own, things like that. 95% of Americans own less than $1 million. Not that surprising. In Congress, over half of congressmen are millionaires. It goes from 5% to 50% of congressmen have a net worth of over $1 million. And this one is always a fun one for my students, the age breakdown. About 32%, almost a third of the United States population is younger than 25. We have a big young generation happening right now, with another 40% being between 25 and 55. Now, these numbers don't line up exactly with the age brackets for Congress. I couldn't find a perfect one-to-one matchup of these two data sets, but take a look at how different Congress looks from the rest of the United States in terms of age. Almost 50% of Congress is over 60 years old. Now, compare that to only 16% of the United States is over 65. I know, again, that doesn't line up just perfect, but way older average age of Congress than the rest of the United States. And I put this up here. This is 0.1% was the smallest amount that would show up. 0% of Congress is under 25 because people under 25 can't go to Congress, obviously. Now when we look at these statistics, we can understand a reason for a lot of them. I mean, narratively, it makes sense, right? People under 25 can't be in Congress. So there can't be any direct representation of young people in Congress. I mean, that makes sense. You need disposable income to run for Congress. So I guess it makes sense that congressmen tend to be wealthier than the average Americans. However, when we see this statistical overrepresentation of certain groups of people, it has to make us wonder about the potential biases that exist within our representatives. Now, this doesn't mean that a male congressman can't, with fidelity and to the best of his ability, represent his female constituents. Of course not. But when we see such a huge disconnect between how our country looks and how our Congress looks, we have to wonder who has a disproportional amount of access to power and whose perspective is represented in the passing of our laws. So on that bright, sunshiny note, I'll leave you, and we'll come back next time with a look at the executive branch. See you then.